What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. A single spark thrown into a pile of dry, forgotten tinder can ignite an entire empire. And right now, while Russia is drowning in the mud of its own special military operation, another spark is quietly heating up in the Caucasus. One that Moscow prays nobody notices. But people do notice, they always do. Especially when the man behind that spark is Ramzan Kadyrov, a ruler who has spent 2 decades building his own miniature kingdom inside the Russian Federation, complete with his own army, his own ideology, his own oil routes, and his own ambitions. The Kremlin spent years feeding this monster, nurturing it, empowering it, forming a symbiotic relationship based on intimidation and fear, but Kadyrov is not immortal, and reality is painfully simple, straight to the point. He is in his final years, physically deteriorating, increasingly paranoid, obsessed with legacy, and surrounded by sons who, frankly speaking, are not ready to control a volcanic republic that only functions under his brutal grip. And here is the nightmare scenario for Putin, the one that keeps Russian security elites awake at night. What if Kadyrov decides that the greatest legacy he could leave behind is not loyalty to Putin, not service to the Kremlin, but independence? What if he chooses to resurrect the dream that Moscow tried to bury under 2 gruesome wars? What if he decides to strike while Putin's military is exhausted, depleted, disorganized, and bleeding out in Ukraine? And suddenly everything becomes possible. If not now, then when? And when something becomes possible in the fragile empire, it becomes dangerous. So today, let's explore the military feasibility of a Chechen breakaway, why this is the perfect moment for Kadyrov to rebel, how the Kremlin would react, and why this scenario could become the first domino that collapses Russia as we know it. Let's start with what Putin pretends does not exist. A fully armed, fully trained, fully loyal private army inside the Russian Federation that does not answer to Moscow, does not follow Russian military doctrine, and does not respect anyone except its own one single leader. This army, the Kadyrovцы. Tens of thousands of fighters who are not simply soldiers. They are a political identity, a militia infused with personal loyalty, indoctrination, tribal allegiance, family ties, and the promise of revenge against anyone who dares to challenge Chechen autonomy. And I mean, sure, these are the same TikTok battalions fighting in Ukraine, not that many but still, but there are tens of thousands of them, and it's not like actual Russian military is better. For years, Putin tolerated this for one simple reason. He needed Kadyrov far more than Kadyrov needed him. Chechnya was pacified only because Kadyrov agreed to rule it with terror so brutal that even the Kremlin could not replicate it. In return, Moscow pumped billions of rubles into the republic, money that never had to be explained, tracked, or justified. That arrangement created a cushion for Kadyrov's ambitions, allowing him to build a state within a state, his own security service, his own media apparatus, his own economy, and most importantly, his own army. Now, combine that with a Russia that is literally overstretched, exhausted, and distracted right now in Ukraine. The second army in the world turned out to be barely the second army in Ukraine. Casualties soared, ammunition vanished, elite divisions were wiped out, most of them in literally the first weeks of the invasion. Equipment production collapsed under sanctions, and the Kremlin has absolutely no appetite, no resources, and no political stability to launch another grinding war in the Caucasus, literally inside its own territory. If Kadyrov wanted independence, this is the moment. Not next year, not in 10 years, now. Because this is the only time when Putin is too weak to say no. It's now or never. Let's talk about the possibility of a new Chechen uprising in our next chapter. Let's zoom out and ask the most important question. Why is this moment so ideal for Kadyrov to attempt a breakaway? The answer is simple. Putin cannot fight a war on 2 fronts. He struggles to maintain even one. The Russian military in Ukraine is stretched like a freight rope. Thousands of tanks gone, elite airborne units reduced to rubble. Ammunition so scarce that soldiers ration bullets like cigarettes in prison. Add constant drone strikes, frontline collapses, mutinies, and a growing discontent inside Russia itself. And that's it, you get a military that cannot afford, cannot sustain, and absolutely cannot survive another insurgency in the Caucasus. Meanwhile, Chechnya is sitting quietly on one of the most militarized populations on Russian territory. And unlike Russians who were dragged into the war with promises of bonuses they never received, Chechen fighters were raised in the wartime culture. This is a society where practically every adult male knows how to hold a rifle, understands guerrilla warfare, and has family members who fought either in the first or in the second Chechen wars, or even in both. And guess what? They remember what independence looked like. They remember the taste of freedom. They remember that what Moscow did to prevent it. And they remember that unfinished business that always returns when the empires fall apart. The most terrifying part for Russia is that Kadyrov would not even need to win in a conventional sense. He just needs to destabilize. The moment he raises the independence flag, even symbolically, Moscow is just forced to react. But, with what? The battered remnants of the army? Mobilized men who barely made it through basic training, if any, if they're lucky to even do this? National Guard units that are already deployed across Russia to prevent unrest? Putin knows that if Chechnya rises and Russia fails to crush it instantly, it messages to every other region that this message just becomes crystal clear. The Kremlin is not in control anymore. This is not just a military problem, it's a psychological earthquake. Chechnya might start the greatest domino effect in the history of modern Russia, and once pieces start falling, there is no way of telling when it ends. Let's talk about it in our next chapter. Here is the true nightmare, not for Putin personally, but for the entire Russian Federation. Chechnya is not a random province. It's not a quiet patch of farmland like Tambov or Lipetsk. It's a region with a successful history of rebellion, a population willing to fight, and a political elite armed to the teeth. If Chechnya breaks away, it becomes a signal flare across Russia that the empire is fracturing. And when one brick cracks, the rest starts to loosen. Just take a look at the map. North Caucasus is in chain republics, each with its own ethnic groups, its own grievances, and its own memories of resistance. Places like Ingushetia, Dagestan, Kabardino-Balkaria, Karachay-Cherkessia. These regions have lived under Moscow's rule only because the Kremlin appeared invincible, unbreakable, and eternal. But once that illusion collapses, eventually it will, everything becomes negotiable. If Chechnya succeeds, even temporarily, others might decide that they no longer need Moscow too. Why should they? That they no longer even trust Kremlin, they no longer fear Putin. And it does not stop in the Caucasus. Further north, Tatarstan, Bashkortostan still remember their autonomous constitutions, their old agreements, their pre-Putin status, when they governed themselves far more independently. Then we also have regions like Yakutia, rich in resources but drained by Moscow. And they just simply might ask why they should continue feeding Russia's budget, while their own people who get these resources, why they remain poor. Even Kaliningrad, geographically isolated, economically squeezed, culturally European, might look at a crumbling Russia and calculate that independence is safer than being dragged down with a collapsing empire. Chechnya would not just rebel, it would break the psychological backbone of Russian federalism. Because once one region says, "we are done," others start whispering it too in unison. And when they hear the same voices saying the same things, when they realize that they are not alone, that is when they finally find out that they have the power over Putin. If rebellion erupts, what does Putin actually do? Let's be honest, he cannot repeat the brutality of the 1990s and 2000s. The Chechen wars of the past were horrific campaigns involving mass bombings, full-scale urban assaults, and entire cities turned into wastelands. Russia today does not have the manpower, ammunition, logistics, or political stability to recreate anything close to that level of military response. Once again, especially because of the ongoing war in Ukraine. So even if Putin wanted to, the army fighting right now in Ukraine is already cannibalizing equipment, resorting to Soviet-era supplies and losing battalions after battalions. The reserves are exhausted, the officers are demoralized, the country's economy is bleeding out. And here is the cruel irony. Chechnya does not need to win militarily, it just needs to drain Moscow. Every soldier Russia sends to fight in the Caucasus is a soldier not fighting in Ukraine. Every ruble spent on pacifying, calming down Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, is a ruble not spent on artillery shells or drones. Every battalion diverted south creates a gap on the Ukrainian front lines. This is the nightmare scenario, a two-way front war that Putin cannot afford, cannot win, and definitely cannot escape. Even worse, the optics will be catastrophic. The moment Russian troops once again bomb Chechen cities, Moscow risks igniting a full-scale ethnic uprising. The Caucasus is not a region where people quietly accept military occupation. It is a region where conflict spreads like a wildfire. A single miscalculation could turn a limited rebellion into multi-republic insurgency. And if Russia loses in Chechnya, that's it, it's over, completely over. An empire that cannot control its own regions, even one single one, cannot call itself a state. Losing Chechnya would be the beginning of a chain reaction that no amount of propaganda, no amount of police repression, and no amount of Putinist mythology could ever stop. The scariest part of this entire scenario is not that Kadyrov might rebel, it's that the conditions for rebellion have never been more favorable. Putin is weakened, isolated, overstretched, and bleeding resources in Ukraine. The Russian military is exhausted. Regions across the Federation are growing restless. Economic inequality is exploding, and the fragile balance holding Russia together is starting to wobble. Kadyrov knows this. His advisors know this. His enemies know this. And deep inside the Kremlin, behind closed doors and sealed corridors, deep underground in his own bunker, Putin knows it too. He knows that if Chechnya makes its move, the entire Russian Federation could unravel. Not through nuclear war, not through foreign invasion, but through internal collapse. Region by region, republic by republic, fracture by fracture. If Russia loses Chechnya during a war it already cannot win, then the question would not be how does Putin survive. The question will be, does Russia survive at all? Well, there you have it, guys. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to my channel for more news like this. If you wish to support our world, the links down below. Thanks so much for watching. See you on Friday.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims are resolve they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in